Hello and welcome to the Chicken Neck podcast. Supported by the Idea Brews Network, we are a bunch of curious individuals based out of the Northeast, and we strive to bring you the best of policy discussions through the intersection with things that affect your and our daily lives. If you like what we do, show your support by sharing our work. Don't forget to leave your comments on this episode in our social media handles. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Chicken Neck podcast. As we begin a new season, our guest today is Mr. Sam Dalrymple, who is a Delhi-based Scottish historian and award-winning filmmaker. He is a graduate from the Oxford University, where he graduated as a Persian and Sanskrit scholar. He has also studied in many other places. He's also the founder of Project Dastan, a peace-building initiative that reconnects refugees displaced by 1947 partition of India. Even after, along with that, he's also a filmmaker, if I could say so. His film Child of Empire premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2022. He's received a lot of accolades for that, and his other works with Dastan has also been exhibited at leading institutions and museums around the world. Among many other things that he does, Sam is also a writer. He has appeared in the New York Times and the Spectator, and his work has been featured in the Time and the New Yorker and the Economist. He's a columnist with the Architectural Digest, where they named him the champion of travel narrative. And among all of this, Sam also decided to sort of write a book on history, which is the subject of our discussion today. His book Shattered Lands, Five Partitions and the Making of Modern India is a bestseller in India today and has been nominated, both shortlisted and longlisted, for several prestigious awards, including the Ramnath Goenka Sahitya Samman 2025. So, among many things that you do, Sam, welcome to the podcast and tell us a bit initially about how you got into writing. I mean, our listeners would probably be thinking, okay, the surname could be familiar, but other than that, what were the factors for you to get into writing?
Thank you so much, Animesh. Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, 6 years ago I was not a writer. I'd graduated from college, and I'd co-founded this organization, Project Astan, and the idea was that partition was the largest forced migration in human history. It's had the most refugees generated, kind of like ever. 10 to 15 million people displaced in the course of 9 months. And very uniquely, basically, no one's had the right to return because since the 60s, at least, there has been virtually no possibility for the normal person to cross that border, the India-Pakistan border. And so we at Project Astan were reconnecting families using kind of, technology, using virtual reality, using Zoom and WhatsApp calls, etc., connecting people back to their old ancestral villages, to their old Haveli, Mandir, Gurdwara, school, masjid, whatever it might be on the other side of the border that they really want to see before they pass. A lot of these people are now in their 90s. So that was really my job for 2 years, going around, often traversing these kind of small villages in search of some kind of, old mosque or temple or house. And we were going to make a documentary about it. Me and my co-founders, Sparsha Huja and Sadia Gurdesi. Sparsha is also from Delhi. Sadia is from Lahore. And we had just got funding from National Geographic to do a big documentary. We were in the process of applying for permits, etc., and we're literally just about to go and do a recce when suddenly COVID hit. And crossing borders and chatting to 95-year-olds were both two very difficult things to do during during COVID. And so I decided to basically pivot. So with the others, we ended up making some animations together. But I had written the script of this documentary. I'd been doing some research, and I felt like there was a story that I still wanted to tell. And so it was during COVID that I began, sitting amongst books all day, stuck in my house for 4 months, and put together a proposal for a book. And that book is the book that you have in front of you now.
So that's essentially your idea of pivoting led to, like many businesses around the world, where they pivot into a much interesting facet of their life. That is what is being happening to you as well. But but Sam, one of the very interesting parts of your work in general, and the book specifically, that I've seen that you've sort of tried to look at partition. There have been other works, but which is not generally the idea of partition, right? Because when we talk of partition, the general idea that you get as a first impression is the partition that happened in the northern side of India, right? And that's the more talked about, of course, for more obvious reasons, because of the violence and because of the families that separated. It's the one that gets all the attention. But you talk about some very interesting facts about the other side of the partition, right? I was just today talking about, no, sorry, I was checking your social media, and you have a piece on how Dubai was almost a part of the larger picture. So maybe before we deep dive into all of the other parts of the book, tell us a bit about how you found that out. I mean, what is the story behind Dubai?
Sure. So the origin of this book, in a sense, is a conversation I had actually with a guy from Tripura when I had I'd had this conversation about how did partition affect you in Northeast India. And he said, which partition? Do you mean the separation of Burma? Do you mean the separation of Pakistan? Or do you mean the one which sent refugees from East Pakistan in when it became Bangladesh in 71? And so he was like, for us living in Tripura and Mizoram, there are 3 moments of border ruptures. And I remember just thinking very specifically, I didn't know that Burma was part of the Raj. And then I went and looked at maps of the Raj in the 1920s, and I was like, okay, Burma's there. Why is no one talking about that? But also, there's this small little city called Aden, which is now in southern Yemen, that's also on these maps. And I was kind of like, okay, this is very, again, this just doesn't feature in the narratives that I grew up with in Delhi at school, etc. And even having studied partition at that point for 2-3 years, I was still surprised. And then I came across this book by a guy called James Onley. He's a librarian who works for an archivist who works for the Qatar Digital Library. And he published this amazing book called The Arabian Frontier of the Raj, which was essentially arguing that the entire Arabian Peninsula, with the exception of Saudi Arabia and northern Yemen, had essentially been part of the Raj, and that we've forgotten this, and it's sort of academic borders have separated the study of Dubai, Qatar, Oman, Yemen from those who study South Asia, and yet under the Raj, if you open the standard list of princely states issued by the government of India under the British, it opens alphabetically with Abu Dhabi before then going on to list kind of Jaipur, Jodhpur, Hyderabad, Kashmir, etc. And so there's this much larger story to be told, essentially about how in the 1920s, and this is the story that I set out to answer in this book, in the 1920s, the entire stretch of land between what's now Yemen and what's now Burma, which contained within it about a quarter of the world's population, was contained essentially within a British mega colony. It was called the Indian Empire at the time, and the Indian Empire was ruled partly directly with British India and partly through princely states. And this has not just produced India and Pakistan, but there are actually 12 nation states today who once had Indian Empire passports: Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar, Burma. And so what I try to do in the book is look at how over the course of 5 decades, there are 5 partitions, 5 moments of rupture that create this new world, in a sense, that get us from a world of, where Gandhi in the 1920s is able to go and, go to Dhaka and to Rangoon and to Aden, all the same year as his Salt March, and still be campaigning in India legally, to a world where actually the year of his famous Salt March, today he would pass through about, 7 different nation states, and there are 12 successor states to the Raj, not just 2. I think we far too often assume that British India is roughly equivalent to basically the modern nation state of India, but actually it's about 2.5 times bigger.
Right. I mean, there are two very short follow-ups to that. One is, of course, what was happening around Dubai and that region. Do you think it was a strategic move to later disassociate the or sort of break down the places into different parts so that they would have control, or they would have at least some sort of more sort of access to resources or access to different places, because what was happening politically as well? Was that the intent that you could
So I
figure out
think that
by looking at?
both the partitions of the Arabian Peninsula and Burma are very linked. I don't think it was that, because oil had yet to be discovered when it was separated off. What actually seems to happen, bizarrely, is that in the 1920s, Indian nationalists begin to coalesce around this idea of Bharatvarsh, this ancient idea that the geography of an Indian nation should be that of the Mahabharata. And that was a geography that did not include Burma and did not include Dubai or Yemen, etc. And it was one that stretched from, kind of Sindh to Assam and from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. And it's the kind of change from, there are some early nationalists like Nauroji who talk about inheriting the steel frame of the Raj. He basically wants to inherit the full Raj and just take over from the Britain's borders in some sense and put Indians in charge. Whereas what later nationalists like Gandhi argue is that actually, Gandhi argues that people living in southeastern Burma actually are not tied to the concept of the Indian nation in the same way, and he argues that the central focal point of the Indian nation is the Mahabharata epic, which is one of the earliest epics in world history, at least 1000 BC, if not much earlier. And so the fact that this region has been tied together since then by this epic, I think we forget how new, though, the idea was, in a sense, to create a nation state on those borders. No one in Greek nationalists, when they were trying to get independence from the Ottoman Empire, Greek nationalists weren't using Homer's Odyssey as, a roadmap for how to build a Greek nation, in the same way that Indian nationalists in the 1920s are.
So it's very interesting you talk about this aspect, right? Because as I was reading, I could also see that, like you talk about the concept of Bharatvarsh and the idea of Burma as well. So, and there's this underlying sort of you could call it the political narrative of the day, where they wanted a certain geographical area, like you just mentioned, right, of to be part of the idea of India or Bharatvarsh. Why do you think, could you figure out any reason as to why they were only focusing on such areas and not the entirety of the region in that case, or at least the larger part of Burma, maybe, even if not, let's say, in the Arabian, the region around Dubai or all of those places?
Sure. No, I mean, I think this is what's so fascinating about the 1920s, is that all of these ideas are in flux. Not all nationalists are agreeing. And so there's actually a big fight in the early 1930s, late 1920s, between the leading politician of Burma, who is a guy called Mahatma Uttama. Mahatma Uttama is Burma's leading kind of Buddhist monk. He's an acolyte of Gandhi's. He's brought, the non-cooperation movement into Burma based off Gandhian methods, and he is, for the biggest guy in the Indian National Congress's Burma wing. And yet, when Gandhi comes in, I think 1929, he and Gandhi fall out over this, because Gandhi says Burma is not part of Bharatvarsh, and if they vote to remain part of the Indian nation, then of course they would be welcome. But it's not part of the we're not trying to inherit the whole British Empire. We are trying to inherit the sacred land of the Mahabharata. Whereas Ottama says no. Burma is an integral part of India, and after all, Buddha came from Bihar to Burma. We've been linked for centuries. And again, I think that one of the, here we are on the Chicken Neck podcast, as I'm sure we'll get to in this conversation, I think one of the great tragedies with regard to the Burma partition that eventually unfolds is the fact that there was no clear boundary between where India ended and where Burma began. There are numerous Burmese empires that stretch far into modern day India. Nagaland, Mizoram, all of these areas speak Tibeto-Burman languages. And the Ahom dynasty was finally extinguished by the Burmese empires. Likewise, the Bengal Sultanate very frequently stretched into what's now Burma. And, until as late as the 1930s, there is still a sense that Manipuri Brahmins are crucial to legitimizing rulers in Burma. So, when I think it's Bahmore tries to become the kind of Subhas Chandra Bose of Burma, essentially, the kind of leader of the Burmese the Burmese pro-Japanese wing of World War II. He is, in a sense, coronated by Manipuri Brahmins in a throwback to earlier Burmese tradition. So, in some sense, these areas had always been tied. There was no clear sense of where one world ended and where the other began. But for Gandhi, reading the Mahabharata, he is very certain that that is the stretch of land that we want. And I think the crucial thing is that a lot of Indian nationalists were unfamiliar with the Northeast because of the fact that train lines did not go through there, because of the fact that it was often cut off from the transport networks of the rest of the Raj. Most people going from Bengal to Burma would go by boat because it was easier than trying to go through the Patkai Hills. And I think that is one of the key reasons why, in some sense, the nationalists in both Kolkata and in Rangoon were so unfamiliar with this region.
I think that's a very interesting way of putting it, because one thing that of course is the whole interaction between Gandhi and when he visited Burma, because in your book, interestingly, you pointed, of course, that Burma ends up having a better relationship with Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose later during the Japanese War, when he comes with the INA. The second part is, and which is intriguing, is the fact that you talk about the Manipuri Brahmins and their influence, because one aspect that has been often told to us in the Northeast is the importance of the Manipuri Brahmins and the Manipuri community in general with respect to Indian epics like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana. So that connection stretches to Burma as well. And then, of course, the the geographical factor that you talk about. It's a very interesting, I think, tripartite way of putting at it. But you also mentioned this very interesting story about a person from Tripura who loses his job and then travels to Burma during all this time, and he's trying to find out in his journey, he's sort of navigating the complexities of the relationships that are happening at this point, right?
Yeah. I can't remember his name right now. He's from Shillette. He's not from Tripura, just Shillette next door in what's now Bangladesh. But which was then part of Assam before the partition. And he is a wonderful figure. He's the first round the world Indian cyclist. So he's trying to cycle from Sylhet around the world, and he does it. I feel like there needs to be a film made on this guy. But he writes an amazing Bengali language travel book about traveling through Burma, just as all of the tensions between kind of Indians and Burmese communities reach a climax.
Yeah. So I think one interesting part about this entire thing that you talked about the Burmese Empire is the fact that I cannot but recall, most of our Assamese history today that is being written and told to us, unless you're a historian, somebody who would read in much more details. But the layman's history is essentially you study till the Burmese coming to Assam and then destroying the Ahom kingdom, in which case the helpless, at the point where the Ahom king are left without resources, they go to the Britishers and they seek help to setting up posts in certain regions. And then the history goes on to talk about how the Britishers came to Assam, set up their, their businesses, and then they settled. But this aspect is actually interesting for a lot of us because of how later, as the British stayed here for so many years, hundreds of years, then there's a different way of looking at the Burmese. Because if you look at it, even though they were fighting much like any other rulers, the Burmese actually came to this part of the world much, much before than a lot other kingdoms came to this part.
Yeah, I think that one of the key things that we overlook and one of the things that I think surprised me the most researching this book is how much when Burma is being separated, it's unclear whether Assam will be attached to Burma or India, and no one's really certain because the same treaty, the Ahoms themselves migrated to India from what's now Burma. They were from kind of originally what's now Shan State. Um, and when the Brits arrive, that whole region had essentially been part of the Burmese Empire. And so, as far as the Brits were concerned, the Northeast as a whole was as much looking towards Burma as it looks to India. And today, basically because of all the insurgencies that have racked through the Northeast since, I think the Indian state has been very keen to emphasize the links with India and not the links with Burma. But when you look at the writings from the 1920s, before any of these insurgencies have drawn out, that's very much not the case. It's seen as a place that's as much in one foot in one world and one foot in the other world. And so, and I think that the Ahoms themselves are a prime example of that. They begin essentially as a Shan kingdom. Ahom is the same word ultimately as Shan. It's a different dialect of the same word, and ultimately Siam in Thailand. And until the Ahoms convert to Hinduism, they are following basically kind of Shan traditional religious practices, and they gradually kind of adopt a more Vaishnav approach, much like, for example, the Manipuri community. But it's by 1920s, it's still very much not clear where it's going to go. And so I think one of the people who writes clearest about this is Fizo, later the leader of the Naga movement, who writes very passionately about how he's not sure which country his homeland, which new colony his hometown is going to end up in. So I think it's Konama he's from in Nagaland, which was then part of Assam. And he wasn't sure whether the new Burma border is going to include his region or not, because the ultimately I think they choose one of the kind of British treaties lines to be where the border is going to fall, but it's unclear.
Right, and I think you also point that out about the Fizo aspect as well. Many, and the interesting part is that many stories still remain. For instance, Fizo and his relationship with Nehru are tales that you would hear even if you go to Nagaland today. And I think that's one very interesting thing that you pointed out in your book about the relationship between the two, and Nehru's sort of reaction to Fizo's remark on independence, Nagaland, something that still, at least the ideas of which still in the fringes still exist in those regions, right?
Yeah. And I mean, he wasn't the only one. I think there was far more conversation between nationalists in this region and the governments, both of India and of Burma, than we tend to imagine. So, I think it's important that Fizo is communicating with Nehru, but he's also just spent the last 20 years living in Rangoon. And so Fizo's entire political vocabulary is one that's based in the fact that he witnessed Burma's separation from Rangoon. He witnessed the movement about, are we Indians or are the Burmese people a separate people, And his whole vocabulary of political autonomy, etc., comes from witnessing those debates from Rangoon itself. And I think that once again, we look far too much through a kind of modern national lens when actually the geography that he was familiar with was one that equally stretched to Kolkata as it did Rangoon. And he has spent as much time in both cities. And so he both is familiar with the vocabulary of Indian nationalists in Kolkata and of nationalists in Rangoon, and he moves very easily between the two worlds.
And I think, the interesting part for me over the last few years has been I've tried to visit a few countries towards the Southeast Asian part, or the part that's the larger part of from the Chicken Neck corridor, right? And in one of our episodes we had with the Chicken Neck podcast was with a professor from Arizona University, Miss Yasmin Saikia. So she's also another person who's been writing a lot on this region, and she mentioned about some similarities of delicacies. For instance, the sticky rice that that we are very we associate with Thailand and all of these other countries, for instance, or even here in Malaysia, is very similar to one of the rice that we find in Assam. So it's because, and the food habits are also somewhat similar than what you would probably, the natural food habits are much more similar than what you would find now. But of course, I mean, we have all grown fond of the butter chicken of the north as well, even in Assam and those regions. But if you look at traditionally the kind of practices, like you said, the Shan religion that they sort of practice, not the religion but the practices of the Ahoms, is very similar to what you would find in this part of the world as well, which is very interesting and intriguing with regards to, which was broken down, of course, because of the other side of the national consciousness. But just to add on to that, so I mean, my other part of the question about Fizo and Nagaland was that you talk about the idea of how the Second World War played some role in developing a sort of political consciousness around this region, right? So what was that particular aspect about? Could you tell us what you experienced while researching about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key thing is, the Battle of Koima and the Battle of Imphal are two of the most central events in World War II. And they are not just fought by the Indian Army, they are fought by soldiers from across the world. There are regiments from West Africa and from South America and from, and from Singapore, etc., and from China, all on the Allied side, fighting against the Japanese in Kohima, in Imphal. And with the world coming to these regions, suddenly there's a huge flurry of industrialization in the region, roads being carved through the region. Suddenly, people are seeing kind of, people who've barely seen aeroplanes, and this had been one of the least developed parts of the Raj. As I said, there was no road that went through the Patkai Hills. There were 3 dirt tracks that went through the Patkai Hills total. And in the course of World War II, that will suddenly change quite dramatically as suddenly the world descends on this region. And I think it's the first time, in a sense, that the Northeast India pivots distinctly towards India because all of these roads are suddenly built by the British. But it's very late, right? It's just a few years before independence that suddenly there are very good roads going from Dimapur all the way to Kohima, Imphal, etc. I think one of what you said earlier, I think that about food delicacies, etc. I there's a book that I love by Thant Mintu, one of the great Burmese writers. He wrote it, and I think it's called Where India Meets China, all about the history of. Um, he writes about how when he landed in Manipur, he realized very quickly, chatting to a bunch of Indian tourists, that as a Burmese person, he was far more familiar with Manipuri history than any of his North Indian friends. So all these guys from Delhi and Rajasthan who know nothing of the region, and yet when he arrives as a guy from Burma, he knows all the words for the food, he knows all about their interactions in a home history, and kind of it's because it's such a central place in the Burmese imagination in a way that it's not central to the North Indian imagination, which is centered on the Mughal Empire and the Sultanates and the Guptas and the all of these different empires, the Kushans, and so I think that World War II changes everything.
And this changes in the sense that, was there a greater national consciousness at this point?
I mean, again, I think that what's very important to remember is actually until the late 1940s, there is a national consciousness that's growing, but it's one that's accompanied with numerous other national consciousnesses. So I think that far too often in our textbooks, we talk about the growth of a national consciousness rather than national consciousnesses, So at the same time as there's a growing sense of Indian nationality, there's also a sense of Naga nationalism. There's also a sense of Punjabi nationalism. Bengal is talking about maybe they're going to get an independent Bengal. There's a big movement for an independent Dravida Nadu in South India. There is a proposal alongside, the creation of Pakistan, etc. You have proposals for an independent Northwest Frontier, an independent Sindh. You have proposals for an independent Telangana, for a homeland for Dalits. And so I think there are a lot more proposals that get turned away than we realize. And I know that you want to talk about the Reed plan at some point. So I think this might be a good time to talk about it.
Yeah. Yes, of course. That was going to be my next question as well, because you talked about proposals, and we have talked about the shared history. We have talked about consciousness, which is one side of what was happening. The other side was that that there was division in sort of boxing of places based on how the Raj wanted to run it, right? So what was and one of the counter proposals was by this person who was working for the Raj, and which you call the Reed plan, or that's what is more famously known as. So, what is this Reed plan? Because I found very interesting. Could you tell our listeners and us about a bit about that?
Sure. So the Reed Plan emerges essentially once World War II happens, once the Northeast becomes the frontier. Suddenly, all of these British officials are suddenly going to the region for often the first time. A lot of these guys have been sitting in kind of Guwahati or Shillong, but suddenly they're going all the way up to Manipur, to Kohima, etc., and suddenly realizing, and they all kind of realize at the same time around 1944, that quite how arbitrary the um, the border between India and Burma really was, and how much the Northeast there was the border cut through the middle of Naga communities, etc. So the Reed Plan was really a proposal that didn't go anywhere, but that briefly raised the idea that maybe the borders should be moved such that there might be an independent Northeast India, for example. It's actually not just one plan. I think David Siemlier, I'm not sure if that's the correct way to pronounce his surname, but is the great scholar on this, based in Shillong, and he writes brilliantly how there are a series of proposals, but it ultimately doesn't go anywhere. As late as 1946, they're talking about potentially moving the Burmese border to incorporate parts of Northeast India, but also potentially to kind of create an entire dominion so that you would get an independent India, Pakistan, and a kind of northeastern Indian majority Adivasi state, essentially. And so it's one of several plans, but it never really goes anywhere because I think it's only raised in 1944, just before nationalists essentially take over the government in 1946, and then ultimately gain independence in 1947. And so, it was raised too late, essentially. But I do think that had the Reed Plan been raised a decade earlier, you could have seen a very different outcome. You could have seen very different borders, and you may have seen an independent Northeast, independent of India or Burma.
I mean, there's so many different questions that come to me as I hear you talk about that. Starting from the aspect of what might have been about a position of an independent place sandwiched between India and China at this point, because the counter narrative is that you'd just be like you'd be the punching bag for both places. But of course, that's only time could have said. And if you see, I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure our listeners and you, of course, many talk about this. I remember as we grew up during the times of insurgency, sort of groups like Ulfa or the other militant groups from Nagaland or Manipur, they would always say, we have all the resources, we have all the people, why should we be a part of India? That's something that even if as fringe element, that has remained for a much longer time beyond the timeline that we have been discussing. But of course, implications is the last part of the podcast that we wanted to sort of look into as well. And my first sort of idea that I wanted to, because you talked about Manipur, you talked about the whole Burmese traveler coming and saying that you're much more familiar with the delicacies. So there also something that's been happening in Manipur of late, right, where the Chakmas and many other groups have been in the middle of a lot of crisis. But could you tell us about, in the past, how in the middle of all of these partitions, all of these divisions, artificially or so called, was happening, how were the Chakmas or the Mizos caught in the middle of all of this? Because you also document a part of that as well.
Sure. I think that in order to understand the conflicts in Northeast India, it's important, I think partition's absolutely central, because in some sense, many of the insurgencies are made to challenge these partitions. These were almost all done without the knowledge or participation of those who actually lived in the region, in the borderlands. Most notably is Fizo, who, in the early days of vocalizing the Naga independence movement, does not refer to it as trying to separate Nagaland from India, but rather reunite the Indian Nagas with the Burmese Nagas. In a sense, he's trying to undo the partition and reunite two Naga communities. Of course, that is not how it ultimately goes, and once the Indian army cracks down on one side and the Burmese army cracks down on the other side, things go a bit differently. But, likewise, in order to understand the Rohingya genocide, it is important to understand that the Rohingya are essentially a group of, indigenous people from Arakan who speak a dialect related to Bengali, who, at partition of Burma and India, they consider whether the border should be made along linguistic lines, but they ultimately decide it's going to be on the basis of this random treaty in 1802 or something. As a result, you get these basically kind of Rohingyas stuck in Burma, even though many of them are actually Pakistani nationalists at the time. And so when the Burmese army cracks down there, they do so in an attempt to remove Bengalis and send them back to India. So it's linked to this whole partition story. In order to understand the situation with the Chakmas, you've got to understand the story of 1947, where arbitrary borders were basically made so that these states would be viable. So I think it's, when Cyril Radcliffe is tasked with drawing the boundaries, he does not do so just on the basis of Hindu and Muslim majority districts. He does so also on the basis of how do we make these actually viable states. And he decides that the Chittagong Hill Tracts have to be given to Pakistan because East Pakistan's biggest port, Chittagong, needs a hinterland. It can't be a city surrounded by Indian land, even though the Chittagong Hill Tracts were over 90% Buddhist and animist at the time. In order to understand, conflicts around the Assam agitations, you've got to understand the fact that, the overwhelming refugee crisis that accompanied the 1971 war and the Pakistani army's crackdown in what became Bangladesh. I think it is hugely, hugely important, all of this. And, the fact that I think it's in the course of 1971, 1 in 12 Pakistani civilians becomes a refugee in either India or in Burma. And they go to both. But essentially, it's the states of West Bengal, Assam, Meghalaya, Mizoram, and Tripura who are suddenly overwhelmed, as well as Western Burma, that is suddenly all overwhelmed by a refugee crisis. And it's that leads to this idea of, for example, a national register of citizens. We saw the NRC and CAA protests a few years ago. That's all rooted in conversations that emerge from 1971. These conversations about who belongs where, and an attempt, in a sense, to project these borders that had been arbitrarily branded upon the landscape, back in time. But I think perhaps the greatest legacy of partition in the Northeast is basically the fact that we call it the Northeast at all. It wasn't before partition an appendage barely connected by a chicken's neck. Tripura was, for example, a thriving economy closely connected to South Asia's greatest port in Chittagong, right? There was just sort of, I think kind of 80 kilometers to get things from Tripura to South Asia's biggest port. Suddenly, in the wake of partition, it suddenly is a 2,000-kilometer journey from Agartala to the nearest port in Kolkata that has to go round the entirety of northeast India through the Chicken's Neck, often in areas that had no roads at the time. And so, the very idea of the Northeast as a strange appendage, as somewhere that's often considered kind of, cut off from the rest of India, not as well developed as India, etc., is entirely a post-1947 phenomenon. And no one really talks about that pre-1947 because these states were well integrated with India before then, Like Assam was as connected to, like the rivers all went through Dhaka. But suddenly, the main route to get goods into the rest of India is cut off from people in the northeast. And I think we overlook that. We overlook the fact that, you know, the entire modern politics of the Northeast is a result of these partitions, is a result of being cut off. In some sense, it's not. Far too many books on the Northeast talk about it as this kind of, this backwater that had been long isolated from the rest of the world. In fact, I think it was one of the most connected regions of the world. It was the kind of Khyber Pass of Eastern India, the Manipur Valley connecting Eastern India to Burma, and has more ethnic groups that have come from a more diverse group of places than anywhere else. That's because of how much migration occurred in this region. And so it was, in a sense, the least likely place to suddenly have borders shunted down. And I think that that's the reason for the Northeast's diversity, is because it was always one of the most connected places in India, but one which was suddenly ruptured.
No, I think that is true, because even now when we go to, for instance, we go to Meghalaya, there are passes where you'd see, and there there'd be written that there's a trail which runs to Bangladesh, because Bangladesh and Meghalaya share such close border. Assam in many parts share such close border, and this entire the whole port route that you mentioned is also so uniquely and recently, in a more political sense, the prime minister of Bangladesh talked about the Chittagong port and the northeastern region. And I think in reply, the prince or the king of Tripura said that Chittagong port used to be ours. So there's always that shared, I think, I wouldn't call it rivalry, but I think it's a shared sense of uh, shattered history that probably has been with us, and that's
Mm.
something we can't help because of lines that were drawn. And I like you said, I've often thought about this idea of how more prosperous could this region be if it was connected much better to its neighboring ports, right? Because our ports were suddenly stuck, our economy was suddenly broken, right? And suddenly we were in the middle of what we became landlocked in a way, and therefore we only had the chicken neck to connect us to the rest of the country. But on that, and it's a
I
very
think you
interesting
mentioned Meghalaya.
way of looking. Right. Yes.
You mentioned Meghalaya, and the biggest. There's the Gentia Hills, and the biggest Gentia city was Gentiapur in what's now Bangladesh. And so you can
Right.
see these connections everywhere that you go in Bangladesh. You can see that the enormous Garo population in modern day Bangladesh. These were, in a sense, the main market towns for these communities. So the whole economy in the Garo Hills or the Gentia Hills revolved around bringing goods from the hills down into Bangladesh. And so to cut them off from their primary markets was to cut them off from their entire economy.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think you mentioned a very interesting story about a person who tried to build an airport in Tripura, right? And then became as rich as the king of Tripura as well. So there's that story of being rich in this region as well, which till a very long time we were seen as pretty poor after partition as these
Mm.
regions. Even today, if you look at the conversations, it's more like that the states are run on aids that are given by the government. There's always that question of that there's no industry, there's no development. It's only of after so many years of independence that we have actually had that turn around. So I think there's that part of it as well, whereas we were very prosperous because of the trade, and it is only through trade that we could bring in the money. uh, but I mean, towards the end of it all, I am very intrigued by the vast mammoth of research that you have done in this region. And I know that we are short of time, and but I also, one of the objectives of this podcast is to also influence a lot of young people from at least I mean the country in general, but also in the region, to do more research. Because like you said, and I completely accept the fact that there is so much gap in the kind of literature that we read in this region. And could you tell us about how you went about reading these resources so that people around the region could read more and find out more about their own history?
Sure. I think the key thing was a mix of traveling, seeing the monuments, understanding where these things come from. I think that my I would not have been able to write half of this without having spent basically a month and a half traveling around Tripura, around Jorhat, around Manipur, around Nagaland, and then down to Sibsagar, and seeing how these lands were connected, but then also visiting the other sides and seeing how they were also connected to the other sides. Um, there is a wealth of scholarship that's emerging on this region. I think it was very lacking until about 20 years ago, but with the peace that's emerged in the wake of all of these insurgencies and violence, more and more scholars have been going. So I think Yasmin Saikia, who you were mentioning, is a brilliant scholar. I think also David Siemlier, who I mentioned earlier. There's a whole wealth of research, I think, from Burma, and I think that more people should be aware of the research that's on that side. I think Thant Minh U's book that I mentioned earlier, where India meets China, is a brilliant book that introduced me at least to the connections on that side of the border. And I think again we far too often think about the region as bounded by modern national identities, rather than thinking obviously before the Burma partition, Nagas in Kohima were much more connected to the Nagas in Burma than they were to anyone in Kolkata, and understanding communities that cross borders, understanding that the Chakmas on this side are related to the Chakmas on that side, that it's all so important. But I think that there is more and more good scholarship coming out every year now, particularly as archives open up, as the region becomes more conducive to research and scholarship, etc. And so I think that it's one of the unmitigatingly kind of good things to come out of the last few years, that until 30 years ago, foreigners could not even travel in this region. Now you can go and just sort of very easily. I mean, it's still very difficult as a foreign scholar to get into the archives. I as a foreign scholar could go very happily into the Delhi National Archives, but I wasn't going into the ones in Mizoram, etc. But as a tourist, I'm able to go now to the great, beautiful sites of Unakoti, to visit the amazing Vaishnav temples of the Manipur Valley, to see the amazing the amazing sort of old chieftain houses of Nagaland, or the early churches of Nagaland. And I think that the monuments, in some sense, tell the story. I think that the government in general has created this image of the Northeast as a land barren of built heritage, and one which is primarily kind of people in lovely textiles, with traditional dance, etc. And yet you only have to arrive in Guwahati and see the amazing Kamakya temple, or go to see the standing stones of Meghalaya, see the dolls of Sibsagar, to see quite how intensely rich the history of Northeast India is, and also how much connected to everywhere, how global it is. You just have to go to Tawang to see that, here's a Tibetan monastery sitting in this side of the Tawang feels like something that could equally be in Bhutan as it could Tibet, whereas some of the structures in what's now Tripura feel like they could be in Unakoti feels like it could be in Elora, one of these amazing rock cut things. So I think that the heritage of this region should be promoted more, and scholars should go there. I think that the once the art of this region, the architecture and the heritage gets more richly celebrated, I think a lot more people will come and study this. And I think it's one of the bits of research that I've enjoyed the most researching this book has been chatting to scholars from Tripura and Manipur, and it has no end increased my love of this country.
Think there's so much food for thought that you just left, right? You just talked about the fact that you have now access to all of these places. I was just thinking about, and to the previous conversation that we had, that because of the entire series of migration that has happened, many of these states closed down. You have in many places you need an inner line permit to enter. Even I would need an inner line permit to enter, even in spite of being from Assam. Uh, there's also that example of Tripura. Tripura, in spite of being so prosperous at one point, now is seen as a political hotbed of language differences, of ethnicity,
Mm.
and the troubles that comes around indigeneity versus the language question as well. And this, whether we like it or not, like you said so well in this podcast, that it has to do a lot with the history that was created in 1947. But much like that, I think
Mm.
it's so diverse. And as you were talking about it, I was just thinking about, even in spite of being from the Northeast, that I've actually to listen it from somebody who's visited and talked about, let's say, the monasteries, and how different the monasteries are in, let's say, in Tawang, versus when you come to Assam, you see the Vaishnavite temples, which is very different,
Mm.
and the culture is so diverse, versus when you would go, let's say, to a Manipur and see the very old rock cuttings of temples, and that traces them back. But also the church, and I think there's a lot we could have discussed also about the church aspect, and how Christianity had its roots in many of the states, right? But I
Mm.
think that's, I hope that your shattered partition is just the first of many to come, and we'll have many more conversations. I know there's a lot that we had to do to meet for this very short time. But Sam, it's an honor to have you. I hope and I look forward to having you for a much more longer duration, so that we can talk about each part of your book as for a longer time. But thank you so much for making the time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you in the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a complete delight.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode of the Chicken Neck podcast, check out our other episodes available across all major streaming platforms and help us grow by spreading the word. And for more updates, do follow us on our social media handles.